"Pick that up, sweetheart." Those were the last words Dr. Whitfield spoke before he learned what happens when you mistake silence for weakness. Operating Room 3 at Seattle General in San Diego smelled of antiseptic and cold steel under lights that hummed like angry wasps. The pre-dawn darkness pressed against the windows. Megan O'Brien moved through the space with mechanical precision, her scrubs crisp as fresh paper, her hands arranging surgical trays with the kind of efficiency that made waste impossible. She'd done this same prep 6,000 times. Maybe more. The count stopped mattering around year 8. Close up on those hands now, steady as surgical lasers, calloused in ways nurse hands shouldn't be. A faded scar crossed her left knuckles, thin as thread, white against the tanned skin. That scar was from Fallujah. A mortar fragment. She'd sewn 17 Marines back together that same day before anyone asked her name. The locker room was empty at 5:56 a.m. Megan opened her personal storage unit, beneath the spare scrubs, and touched the pair of worn combat boots sitting there like artifacts in a museum. Desert tan leather, the soles caked with dust she'd never cleaned off. Baghdad sand still visible in the treads. 40 missions across that city. 40 times she'd walked into places no one should ever have to walk. She'd held that dust in her lungs for so long it felt like home. Her fingers lingered on the laces for 3 seconds. Then she closed the locker. The metal door swung shut with a soft click. The surgical resident who'd drawn morning prep duty, a third-year named Chen, appeared in the OR doorway carrying a stack of surgical packs. He watched Megan for a moment, visibly trying to understand how she could prep a full operating room in the time it took most nurses to locate their supplies. "How do you move that fast?" he asked. Genuine curiosity. Not challenging. Just noticing. Megan didn't look up from the instrument tray she was organizing. "Repetition," she said. "Same movements. Same order. The room teaches you where everything needs to be." Chen nodded and set the packs down on the steel counter. He started to leave, then turned back. "Did you work in a trauma center before this?" She continued arranging the instruments without hesitation. Retractor. Forceps. Needle driver. Each one sliding into its precise location. "Somewhere like that," she said. Her voice carried no inflection. No invitation to continue the conversation. Chen got the message and disappeared back into the corridor. Alone again, Megan's eyes moved across the room in a pattern she'd refined over years that had nothing to do with nursing. She noted the exits, main door, secondary corridor access, the service entrance through the storage wall. She identified vulnerable positions, sight lines, places where someone could move without being seen. Her gaze lingered on the code cart tucked in the corner. The location of the crash cart. The positioning of the monitors. It wasn't paranoia. Paranoia was seeing threats that didn't exist. This was pattern recognition. When you'd spent 10 years as a Master Chief Petty Officer with the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, when you'd been the senior enlisted medical operator for the most dangerous operations in Baghdad, you never stopped reading a room for weakness. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm from the corner as Megan ran a final check on the anesthesia setup. Everything was perfect. Everything was always perfect. Because in her previous world, imperfection meant people died. Sometimes a lot of people. That standard didn't change just because now she was working in a civilian hospital under a name that wasn't on any official military registry, with a medical license that would pass any background check because everything about it was genuine. She'd been at Seattle General for 2 years, 3 months, and 18 days. Not that she was counting. The doors opened at 6:15 a.m. Dr. Raymond Whitfield entered the OR corridor like he owned the hospital, which, in practical terms, he did. Chief of surgery for 7 years running. Board member seat cinched through connections built over a 15-year career climbing from resident to department head. His white coat hung perfectly pressed over a tailored shirt that probably cost more than Megan's monthly rent. His presence commanded immediate deference from everyone in a 5-foot radius. The surgical resident straightened. The other nurses made themselves smaller. The tech suddenly found urgency in tasks that could have waited. Megan simply nodded and continued arranging supplies. That was what made her visible to him. Not the competence. Whitfield worked around competent people every day. Not the precision. Surgical precision was a baseline expectation. It was the absence of deference. The way she occupied space without apologizing for it. The way her eyes didn't widen when he entered a room. He watched her for a moment, one hand moving to his pocket, the gesture of a man used to having conversations end on his terms. "O'Brien," he said. His voice carried the texture of authority worn like a second skin. Board walkthrough in 15 minutes. Conference room A. Understood, Doctor. She didn't pause in her work. I'll need 5 minutes to secure the OR. Whitfield's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. He wasn't accustomed to nurses who negotiated timelines. 10 minutes, he said. Don't be late. She was ready in 9. The conference room was crowded with the kind of people who made decisions that affected everyone else's lives. Board members in expensive suits. Other department heads. The hospital CEO, a woman named Patricia Huang who actually listened when people spoke, which made her dangerous in a room full of men used to monologues. The morning light came through floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the sprawl of San Diego, all that potential and danger and humanity below them. Whitfield led a presentation on surgical outcomes for the preceding quarter. Numbers climbing in impressive directions. Mortality rates declining. Patient satisfaction scores rising. He positioned himself as the architect of these improvements, and the board nodded along, apparently believing that one man's administrative decisions could change the fundamental nature of how an entire department functioned. Megan stood at the back of the room, positioned where she could see everyone and be seen by no one, a habit formed through years of work in environments where visibility could get you killed. She was there to speak to the surgical nursing protocols she'd helped implement, the checklist procedures that had reduced wrong-site surgeries by 17% in the past 18 months. She was ready to present data. Ready to cite the studies. Ready to be professional. Whitfield was running through the quarterly metrics when he reached a specific case, a post-operative infection rate that had spiked in a particular surgical window. His finger moved across the chart he'd projected onto the screen. The infection rate here represents a protocol deviation, he said. And I think we should all understand how these deviations occur. He looked directly at Megan. The antibiotic prophylaxis dosing in this case was calculated at 2.5 grams of cefazolin 4, he said. Proper dosage for a 300-pound male patient would be 3 grams. This underdosing likely contributed to the post-operative infection. I'm wondering if someone in this room would like to explain how that calculation was missed. The silence in the conference room was the kind that happens when someone's career is being threatened in real time. Patricia Huang's expression shifted. Whitfield's hand moved to the pointer, tapping it against his palm like a conductor's baton. Megan was quiet for maybe 2 seconds. Then she stepped forward. The dosage was correct, she said. Her voice was level. Factual. No apology embedded in the intonation. Cefazolin dosing for surgical prophylaxis is 15 to 20 milligrams per kilogram for patients under 80 kilograms. For patients over 80 kilograms, the standard remains 2.5 grams. The patient in question weighed 310 pounds, that's 141 kilograms. The 2.5 gram dose is appropriate. The prophylaxis wasn't the variable in that infection. The projection shifted. Megan gestured to another line item. The infection source was likely the delayed wound closure. Patient was in recovery for 6 hours post-op before closure was completed. That's where your timeline failed, not the dosage. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old stone. His hand stopped moving. The pointer went very still. Patricia Huang was the one who spoke first. Is that correct, Doctor? The closure timeline was extended due to staffing issues, Whitfield said, his voice carrying an edge now. Not due to any protocol I established. Staffing issues that resulted from the surgical schedule you implemented, Megan said, and something in her voice, not anger, not challenge, just simple fact, made every person in that room sit forward slightly. You scheduled 3 concurrent surgeries with only 1 closing nurse available. The second case ran long. The closure was delayed. That's a systems problem, not a dosing problem. Whitfield looked at her like he was seeing her for the first time. Like he'd just noticed something under a rock that moved on its own. The board meeting continued for another 40 minutes, but the momentum had shifted. Patricia Huang spent the rest of the presentation asking increasingly detailed questions about how the surgical timeline was managed, how conflicts were resolved, where decisions were being made that affected patient outcomes. By the time the meeting ended, Whitfield's quarterly success had taken on a different shape entirely. He left the room without speaking to Megan. But his eyes found hers for a single second, and in that second, she saw the moment when a man decided something. When a decision crystallized into purpose. When a problem was labeled as something that needed solving. She'd seen that look before. Not often. But enough times to know what it meant. They didn't say it out loud in those early hours. The hospital would discover it later, in the way institutions discover things, through whispered conversations in the surgical lounge, through the careful distance colleagues began keeping around her, through the small professional courtesies that started disappearing like water running downhill. But right then, standing in that conference room as the board filtered out, Megan understood that she'd made an error in calculation far more serious than any antibiotic dosage. She'd corrected him in front of people who mattered. Morning round started at 7:53 a.m. Whitfield moved through the wards with his usual entourage, residents, fellows, nurses, the machinery of his surgical empire rotating around him like planets around the sun. The rounds were theatre. Everyone understood the script. The attending physician presented cases. The residents provided history. The nurses retrieved charts and made themselves available. Whitfield made pronouncements, and everyone recorded them like scripture. Megan was present because she was assigned to the cardiac ward rotation. She stood at the periphery, updating charts, maintaining 4 lines, checking monitors. Invisible the way she'd learned to be invisible. Useful without being seen. They were on the 5th patient when a surgical resident, a younger man named Martinez, handed Whitfield a patient chart for review. Whitfield opened it, scanned the information, and his eyes narrowed. "This chart is incomplete," he said. He held it up, and then, with a movement that looked almost casual, he released it. The pages scattered across the floor like startled birds. The chart hit the tile with a sound like bone cracking. Paper skittered across the antiseptic-smelling floor and came to rest at Megan's feet. The hallway went very quiet. 18 people stopped moving. Monitors beeped. Someone's pager buzzed. The ventilator in the nearby patient room wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Whitfield looked directly at Megan, and he smiled. The kind of smile that predators wear. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said. His voice was pleasant. Conversational. The tone you use to ask someone to pass the salt. But the words were a message. They were a statement about hierarchy. About who occupied space in this hospital. About who was important and who was merely useful. The papers lay scattered on the floor. 23 of them, from the look of it. A complete surgical record, now arranged in disorder across tiles that reflected the overhead lights. The young resident, Martinez, looked like he wanted to help, but something in Whitfield's posture made clear that this was a moment with specific choreography. Megan looked at the scattered pages. She looked at Whitfield. She looked at the other nurses watching from the corners of their vision, trying to figure out if they were seeing what they thought they were seeing. Her jaw clenched. Barely visible. Just the muscles tightening along the line of her face. Her breathing remained steady. In through the nose. Out through the mouth. The kind of controlled respiration you learn when you've had to stay functional in situations where panic was the only alternative to action. She bent down. She began gathering the papers with mechanical efficiency, organizing them by page number as she collected them, straightening the edges, reconstructing the chart's original form. Nobody moved to help her. Nobody said anything. They simply watched as she picked up every page and reassembled the file in silence. When she stood again, the chart was perfect. Organized. Usable. She held it out to Whitfield with both hands. "The chart is complete," she said. Her voice was level. Professional. The voice of someone reading dosage information from a label. All 23 pages accounted for. Whitfield took it from her. Their hands didn't touch. He didn't say thank you. He didn't acknowledge her in any way. He simply turned to Martinez and continued the rounds as though the previous 60 seconds hadn't happened. But something had shifted in the hallway. The other nurses were looking at each other. The residents had gone very still. Even the monitors seemed to be monitoring differently, aware that something had changed in the pressure dynamics of the room. Megan returned to her work, but her eyes had changed. They were still scanning the room for exits, vulnerable positions, sight lines. But now they were also registering faces. Filing away the expressions of people who had watched something happen to her. The ones who felt sympathy in their eyes. The ones who looked away. The ones who were already calculating how not to be standing next to her the next time Whitfield decided to make a point. She pulled up the schedule for the day ahead on the wall-mounted computer. Surgery was booked solid. Back-to-back cases from 8 a.m. through 3 p.m. The cardiac ward was particularly heavy. She noted the names of the scheduled patients, the procedures, the attending physicians. One name made her pause: Colonel Marcus Webb, Army Medical Corps, scheduled for emergency cardiac surgery at 11 a.m. No, not emergency. Planned. Elective valve replacement. A routine procedure for a 58-year-old officer with a minor aortic stenosis that needed addressing before it became a problem. She knew that name. She knew it because her son, Daniel, had written it in a letter from Fort Riley. Just a mention. "Colonel Webb seems like a good commander. He said he'd keep an eye on us during the deployment. Make sure everyone came home." That promise meant something to parents with children on their first deployment. It meant a lot. Megan closed the schedule and turned back to her work. But her hands, which had been perfectly steady all morning, held their steadiness now for a different reason. For focus. For purpose. For the understanding that sometimes the world arranged itself in ways that required attention. What she didn't know yet was that the collision of these two moments, Whitfield's humiliation and Colonel Webb's arrival, would crack open the entire careful structure she'd built at Seattle General. That the next few hours would unravel 7 years of institutional confidence. That a man would make a choice in the next 73 minutes that would destroy his own career in the process of trying to destroy hers. That sometimes the people you're protecting turn out to be the ones who save you. But for now, she returned to her rounds, her movements precise, her composure intact, her jaw no longer clenched. Just a nurse in crisp scrubs, moving through the fluorescent-lit corridors of Seattle General in San Diego, carrying the weight of 10 years in hands that no one was looking at closely enough to see. The surgical lounge at Seattle General smelled like cold coffee and competition. 12 staff members sat scattered across worn leather chairs, charts stacked on the side table, the morning sun cutting harsh angles through the windows. Dr. Whitfield stood near the center, not sitting, never sitting. He needed the height advantage, the psychological positioning. He had that look in his eyes, the one that came right before he announced something designed to hurt. "I'm making a prediction," he said, loud enough that everyone stopped scrolling through their phones. His voice had that rehearsed quality, the sound of a man who'd practiced cruelty until it became smooth. "Our newest mid-career nurse won't last a week. Anyone want to take that bet?" The silence was immediate. Not the comfortable kind. The kind where people stare at their laps and suddenly become very interested in the coffee rings on their charts. No one looked at Megan, which meant everyone was thinking about her. That was the point. She stood in the doorway, having just arrived, and felt 12 pairs of eyes slide away from her like water off glass. Her jaw tightened once, just once, and she held it there, controlled the reflex, released it with the precision of someone who'd learned to weaponize stillness. 12 years in Special Forces taught you that reactions were information. Every flinch was a message. Every grimace was ammunition. Bold, someone finally said. Not a real wager. Just a word thrown into the void to make the silence less heavy. Whitfield smiled like a man who'd already won. "I'll take that as cowardice," he said. His eyes found her for just a moment, a flash of calculation, the look of a predator identifying the weakest member of a herd. Then he turned back to his charts, already moving on to his next performance. Megan remained in the doorway, breathing the way she'd been taught to breathe in high-stress situations. Slow. Controlled. The kind of breathing that kept adrenaline from flooding your system, that kept your hand steady when every instinct screamed at you to move. She'd survived worse than a surgeon's public mockery. Kandahar province in the summer of 2011 had worse. A forward operating base in the Sanjan Valley with not enough blood plasma and too many casualties had worse. But this was different. Here, she couldn't respond. Here, she had to let him win the first round because the real stakes hadn't emerged yet. That afternoon, during the board walkthrough, Megan moved through the patient charts with Dr. Whitfield and 2 administrative officers. She'd reviewed his notes on the antibiotic protocols, something in her had flagged it immediately, the same pattern recognition that had saved soldiers' lives in field hospitals. The dosage calculation was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong, but wrong enough. She waited until they were reviewing the cardiac patient from room 407. Waited until the moment was safe. Then she said quietly, "Doctor, I think the vancomycin dose on this chart should be recalculated. Current dosing sits above renal threshold for a patient with this creatinine clearance." The words hung there. Clinical. Respectful. Accurate. The administrator's eyes flickered toward Whitfield, waiting to see how he'd respond to correction in front of witnesses. He smiled. It was the worst kind of smile, not angry, which would have been honest. This smile was constructed, a thing he'd built piece by piece in medical school and perfected over 20 years of running people into walls. "Thank you for your input," he said, drawing the word out like it tasted bad. His eyes promised things, though. His eyes promised that she'd made a mistake. The next day in the cafeteria, Megan carried her lunch tray through the crowded dining area. Pasta primavera. A bowl of soup that steamed in the institutional way of all hospital food. The cafeteria had that smell, antiseptic underneath the food smells, the way all hospitals did, like the building was perpetually in the process of being cleaned and never quite succeeding. She walked past Whitfield's table where he sat with 3 other surgeons, all of them in their own private universe of superiority and carved out space at the hospital's power center. She'd learned to navigate these rooms the way soldiers navigate checkpoints. Head neutral. Eyes forward. No sudden movements. His foot extended as she passed. Just barely. Just casually enough that when her tray crashed to the floor, the impact loud enough that conversation stopped mid-sentence, it looked almost like an accident. The pasta scattered across the tile in a broken constellation. The soup bowl shattered, sending a ceramic shard spinning under a nearby table. 20 staff members watched. "Oh, how clumsy," Whitfield said without looking up from his phone. His tone was conversational, almost kind, which made it infinitely worse. "Someone should clean that up." The room resumed its conversations like a recording had been paused and then restarted. People didn't look at her. They looked at their food. They looked at their phones. They performed the professional disinterest that came from understanding that being seen as sympathetic to Megan was a liability in this ecosystem. She felt her hands clench once. Just once. Felt her shoulders want to tighten, her breath want to accelerate. She forced all of it down into a vault somewhere deep, locked it up with the same discipline she'd used to lock down the trembling in her hands after pulling a Marine with a sucking chest wound across a street in Baghdad under sniper fire. This was smaller. This was manageable. Megan knelt and began picking up the mess. Her movements were deliberate. Careful. Each piece of pasta retrieved and set aside. The broken ceramic handled with precision. She worked in complete silence while the cafeteria resumed its rhythm around her, the sound of forks on plates and low conversation creating a wall of noise that somehow made her isolation feel more absolute. Her jaw stayed loose. Her breathing stayed controlled. She was a statue that picked things up and arranged them in order. When she stood, the tray was clean. The floor was clean. She carried the pieces to the trash and discarded them with a kind of efficiency that suggested this wasn't the first time she'd cleaned up after someone else's violence. That night, the humiliation found its next vessel. During morning rounds the following day, Whitfield reviewed the surgical schedule with his usual performance of authority. Nurses stood to the side. The medical students tried to make themselves smaller. The residents waited for the moment he'd find something to criticize. When Megan approached with the patient charts for room 407, he took the stack from her hands and tossed it casually onto the floor. Papers scattered like snow. The sound was sharp, the percussion of humiliation performed for an audience. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, not even glancing at her. The word landed like shrapnel. Not because it was novel. Because it was calculated. Because he'd chosen that exact diminishment in front of the maximum number of people, at the maximum moment of vulnerability, using a tone that suggested kindness while delivering contempt. Megan's jaw tightened. She could feel her hands wanting to shake, not from fear, but from the effort of restraint, the same effort she'd used to hold a tourniquet steady on a femoral artery while rounds were still coming through the windows. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the physical manifestation of all the things she wasn't allowing herself to do. She knelt. Retrieved every single page. Tapped them into perfect alignment against her thigh, the way you organize anything that matters. When she stood, the chart was pristine. She handed it back to Whitfield without a word, her face a perfect mask of professional composure, the kind that came from 10 years of practice, from 100 moments where displaying her actual state would have gotten someone killed. "Thank you," Whitfield said, already moving past her, already dismissing her, the victory hollow but real. That night in her car, alone in the dim parking garage where the fluorescent lights barely penetrated the darkness, Megan allowed herself what she never allowed herself in daylight. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. Her hands gripped it so tightly her knuckles went white. She let her shoulders shake for exactly 10 seconds. Then she straightened. Started the engine. Drove home to the apartment where she kept the tactical charts for the investigation she wasn't supposed to be running and the photos of her son in his dress uniform, so young and so far away that sometimes she had to check her phone just to confirm he was still alive. What she didn't know was that the call would come at 2:13 in the morning. What she didn't know was that Colonel Marcus Webb, her son's commanding officer, the man who'd held her boy's life in his hands on a forward operating base 4,700 miles away, was being rushed to Seattle General with acute myocardial infarction. What she didn't know was that Dr. Whitfield would be pulled from his bed to perform the emergency catheterization. And what neither of them knew was that the real test was about to begin. The call came at 2:22 a.m. A single text from the hospital dispatch system, the kind that made night nurses pull their scrubs tighter and move faster. Acute myocardial infarction. Army Colonel Marcus Webb. 58 years old. Incoming by ambulance, ETA for minutes. Operating room 3 already being prepped. Megan was pulling on her boots before the second alert chimed, the same boots she'd worn through 40 missions in Baghdad, the leather still holding the dust of streets she'd never quite washed clean. She moved through the dark hallway of her apartment like muscle memory itself, each step economical, each motion purposeful. This wasn't a coincidence. Not this man. Not this night. The universe had a cruel sense of timing. Colonel Webb arrived at 3:14 a.m. on a stretcher that squeaked like a wounded animal against the hospital tile, the paramedics calling out vitals in the clipped staccato of practiced emergency language. Chest pain started during sleep. Wife called 911 at 2:40. No prior cardiac history. Alert and oriented ×3. BP is currently 118/76 but dropping. Megan was already gowning up outside OR3 when they wheeled him past. She caught one glimpse of his face, Grey and clammy, the expression of a man whose body had turned traitor, and she recognized the shape of her son's childhood in his features. The commanding officer who'd promised to bring her boy home safe. The man now coded into an operating table while monitors screamed their electronic warnings into the pre-dawn dark. Dr. Whitfield swept into the operating room like a surgeon who believed himself untouchable, his presence commanding but his hands already trembling slightly as he reviewed the EKG strips. Megan had seen this before, doctors whose confidence was theatre, whose competence was solid but whose nerves turned brittle under pressure. He began the catheterization procedure with textbook precision, advancing the guide wire through the femoral artery with the smooth movements of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. The first 20 minutes were routine. Blood pressure holding steady. Oxygen saturation climbing. The monitors hummed their reassuring rhythm. Megan worked the assist position with the fluidity of someone who'd spent a decade in combat medical situations where hesitation meant death. She anticipated his needs, had instruments ready before he asked, moved through the space around him like they were parts of the same organism. Then at 3:51 a.m., exactly 17 minutes into the procedure, Colonel Webb's blood pressure collapsed. The numbers on the monitor fell like dominoes. 110 to 95 to 78 to 62. The rhythm remained organized but the pressure was hemorrhaging away, and Megan felt rather than heard the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere, that same electric tension she'd felt in Baghdad field hospitals when something had gone catastrophically wrong. His pressure is dropping, she said quietly, already moving to increase the 4 fluids. Whitfield's jaw tightened. I see it. Monitor him. But the fluids weren't working. The pressure continued its deadly descent. 58 to 45 to 38. The monitors began to shriek their alarm tones, and that was when Whitfield's hand stopped moving. His eyes went distant. His face drained to the color of old plaster. Cardiac tamponade, Megan said. It wasn't a question. The clinical picture was unmistakable, sudden pressure drop during a catheterization procedure, the kind of rare but catastrophic complication that killed you if you hesitated. Fluid is compressing the heart. Whitfield stared at the monitors as if they might be lying. His mouth moved but no words came. 3 seconds of silence. 4. 5. The monitor alarm wailed like it was pleading. Colonel Webb's pressure hit 32. The monitors screamed. And Megan moved. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait for Whitfield to find his voice. Her hands moved on their own, pulling an 18-gauge needle from the tray, already sterile and ready, her muscle memory pulling from 100 field surgeries in Baghdad where you operated fast or you operated on a corpse. She positioned herself at the bedside, her touch finding the anatomical landmarks beneath Webb's exposed chest, the xiphoid process, the angle toward the left shoulder. The needle advanced beneath the ribcage in a single smooth motion, the kind of movement that looked casual to the untrained eye but which was the result of a decade of training and a decade before that of combat operations. She could feel the needle sliding through fascia and muscle and pericardial tissue, advancing toward the fluid collection that was killing this man. The pericardial fluid came back into the syringe dark and blood-tinged. 50 milliliters. 60. 70. Each milliliter released was a fraction of pressure relief, a small mercy being delivered one syringe at a time. She watched the monitors as she withdrew the fluid. The pressure began to climb immediately. 35 to 40 to 48 to 55 to 62 to 78. The alarm stopped shrieking. The sinus rhythm clicked back into its steady reassuring pattern. Colonel Webb's oxygen saturation rose from 81 to 89 to 94. The entire sequence had taken 90 seconds. Maybe less. The kind of timing that came not from panic but from the absolute clarity that emerges when everything else falls away and you are simply doing what your hands were trained to do. The room was silent except for the steady beep of the monitors and the soft hiss of the ventilator. Megan removed the needle carefully, disposing of it in the biohazard container with the same precision she'd used to insert it. Only then did she look up. Whitfield was staring at her with an expression that shifted in real time from shock to something else, something darker and more dangerous than mere surprise. His jaw clenched. His chest expanded with breath drawn sharp through his nostrils. She'd seen this look before, on the faces of men who'd been stripped of control, who'd felt the weight of their own inadequacy revealed in front of their subordinates. "You just assaulted my patient," Whitfield said quietly. The words came out measured and precise, which made them somehow more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "That is so far beyond your scope of practice I don't even have the language to." His voice cut off, a surgeon's voice, the kind trained to command rooms and bend reality and never, under any circumstance, be questioned by someone wearing scrubs instead of a long coat. "He would have died in 2 minutes," Megan said. Her voice was level, and that was the thing that made it powerful, not anger, not emotion, but the absolute certainty of someone who'd watched people die and knew exactly what dying looked like. She began removing her gloves, peeling them away from her hands with careful precision. His pressure was 32 and dropping. Cardiac output was approximately 15% of normal. Without pericardiocentesis. "I didn't ask for your medical opinion," Whitfield cut her off, his voice dropped to something colder than before. "I said you're done. Get out of my operating room. Now." She looked at Colonel Webb, his color already improving, his chest rising and falling with the steady rhythm of the ventilator, his vital signs tracking upward with every passing second. The man was going to live. The man her son trusted, the man who'd made a promise to a 20-year-old Marine recruit that he'd bring him home safe, was going to survive the night because her hands remembered Baghdad and her training overrode the protocol that said a nurse knew her place. Megan dropped her gloves in the biohazard bin and walked toward the door. Behind her, she heard Whitfield's phone click on. Heard him dial. Heard him speak in the kind of hushed urgent tone that meant he was calling people who mattered at an hour when only emergencies mattered. "Get me the board chairman," he was saying. "Yes, I know it's 3 a.m. This is an emergency. A HIPAA violation. A scope of practice violation. A physical assault on a sedated patient in my operating room." She didn't stop walking. She knew what was coming the way soldiers know incoming fire. The retaliation would be swift and institutional and thorough. By 6:38 a.m., before the morning shift even started, Megan received the email. "Effective immediately, you are placed on administrative suspension pending investigation into violations of scope of practice during the emergency cardiac procedure on patient Marcus Webb, occurring at approximately 3:51 a.m. on the date. You are not to enter hospital premises or attempt to contact patients or medical staff. Your credentials have been flagged with the state board." By 7:13 a.m., Whitfield had personally called her 3 references: the commanding officers in Baghdad who'd supervised her field medicine work, the Navy doctors who'd trained her, the senior chiefs who could attest to her qualifications. But those calls had a specific tone, a specific framing that would make any reference check look like an official investigation into something far more sinister than a nurse saving a patient's life. By 8:15 a.m., Whitfield had activated his network. His brother-in-law, who chaired the hospital board. His college roommate, who happened to head the state nursing oversight committee. Outside auditors being brought in to comb through years of employment history, looking for any infraction that could be weaponized. Megan sat in her apartment in the pale morning light, still wearing her scrubs because she hadn't even had time to change. Her phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number, a handler she'd never actually met in person but whose instructions she'd been following for 8 months. Cover potentially compromised. Supply rings suspects hospital security breach. Recommend stand down all surveillance. 8 months of work. 8 months of watching, documenting, building a case against the medical supply theft ring that had been operating out of Seattle General's pharmacy, selling controlled substances and surgical equipment on the black market. 8 months of her Navy intelligence placement, her secret assignment that made her presence at this hospital something far larger than just being a nurse. All of it gone. Because she couldn't let a man die when she had the training to save him. The ones who've seen the worst often give the most. Whitfield's brother-in-law sat in the chairman's office at 8 in the morning, the kind of man who'd inherited money and positions rather than earned them, and he made 3 phone calls before his second espresso. The first went to the state medical board. The second went to a private auditing firm that specialized in credential investigations. The third went to someone at the hospital's malpractice insurance company. By noon, the machinery was in motion, not crude or obvious, but surgical. Efficient. The kind of institutional violence that leaves no fingerprints. Whitfield himself handled the references. He called the Naval Academy. He called the VA hospital where Megan had trained. He called a clinic in Virginia that no longer existed on any official records. The people who answered his calls listened to his questions about credential discrepancies and scope of practice concerns, and some of them couldn't answer because they'd been given very specific instructions about what they could and couldn't discuss. Others answered carefully, parsing their words like people walking through a minefield. By the time Whitfield finished, he'd planted enough seeds of doubt that even people who wanted to defend Megan found themselves hesitating. Outside auditors arrived at Seattle General on the third day after her suspension. They wore suits that cost more than Megan's monthly rent and carried leather portfolios that looked like weapons. They requested her employment file. They requested her training certifications. They requested her continuing education credits, her license renewal documents, her background check paperwork from 8 years ago. They photographed everything. They asked questions in that flat, professional voice that suggests they already know you're lying. One of them, a woman with glasses and a face like a adding machine, spent 45 minutes examining the dates on Megan's references, cross-referencing them with her work schedule, looking for discrepancies that didn't exist but whose absence somehow felt incriminating. What the auditors didn't know, what Whitfield couldn't have known, was that Megan's entire nursing career had been a cover operation. Naval Intelligence had placed her at Seattle General 14 months ago to monitor a suspected medical supply theft ring that had been diverting high-grade surgical equipment and controlled substances through a network of black market distributors. Megan's real job wasn't saving lives in the OR, though she'd done plenty of that. Her real job was gathering intelligence. Following paper trails. Identifying which hospital administrators were taking bribes, which suppliers were providing fake credentials, which patients might actually be couriers or laundering operations disguised as medical procedures. Every day on the unit was surveillance. Every shift was intelligence work. She'd been deep cover so long that the line between her real identity and her nurse identity had blurred into something she didn't quite recognize anymore. The suspension meant the investigation went cold. 48 hours of lost access meant 3 months of investigative work evaporated. The supply theft ring would scatter. The couriers would change routes. The money would move to different channels. Everything Megan had built over 14 months of meticulous, invisible work, gone. Her handler called her at 6 in the evening on the third day. His voice was thin and controlled, the voice of someone delivering a casualty report. "Your cover's blown," he said. "The board chairman is connected to someone at the Pentagon." Word traveled fast. "We're pulling you out." Not a request. Not a suggestion. Just the end of something, stated as fact. She had 72 hours to decide what to do next. The Naval Intelligence Office in San Diego would have a file on her desk. She could be back in uniform in a week if she wanted. Back doing real work. Back being herself. 20 hours after the auditors finished photographing her file, Megan sat alone in her car in the parking garage of Seattle General. Engine off. The parking structure smelled like hot asphalt and diesel exhaust, the late afternoon sun turning the concrete gold. She'd driven here out of habit, or maybe desperation, or maybe just because she didn't know where else to go. Her forehead rested against the steering wheel. She'd been sitting there for 40 minutes. The key was on the seat beside her, and she couldn't quite make herself reach for it. Her phone buzzed. A text from Tyler overseas, 3 time zones ahead, written at 3 in the morning because her son couldn't sleep. "Colonel Webb told me you saved his life, Mom. I'm so proud of you." She closed her eyes and allowed herself exactly 30 seconds of tears. That was the allowance. 30 seconds. After that, she wiped her face with the palm of her hand, pressed the heel of her other hand against her sternum, and breathed until her chest stopped shaking. The weight of her blown cover pressed down on her shoulders like a pack full of stones. 14 months of work. The supply theft ring still operating. Medical equipment still being diverted. People still getting rich off the suffering of desperate patients. And she was going to miss all of it because Dr. Whitfield had decided that being corrected in front of colleagues was worse than letting a man die. She started the engine. Drove home. Didn't turn on the radio. Didn't call anyone. Just drove through the San Diego evening with the windows down, the salt air off the coast mixing with the smell of cooking food from restaurants she passed, and tried not to think about all the things she was about to lose. The next morning at 7:15, her phone rang. Maria, a nurse who still worked in the surgical wing, her voice tight and strange. "You need to hear this," Maria said. "Something's happening. Whitfield's doing an appendectomy in OR3. You remember OR3? The old room. The room where Megan had stood in front of God and everybody and pulled a man back from the edge of death." "I'm suspended," Megan said. "I know. But there's something wrong." He looks scared. Like actually scared. "And there's a commotion on the first floor. I don't know how to describe it." "You should." The line crackled with background noise. Then silence. Then Maria's voice again, lower. "Something's wrong." Megan hung up. She was in her car in 90 seconds. She made it to Seattle General in 12 minutes, driving 47 miles per hour in a 35-mile zone, not speeding, not drawing attention. Just moving with purpose. The parking lot was normal. The ER entrance was normal. Nothing visible had changed. She used her old badge. The magnetic strip would fail, the security system would catch her, but it would take time. She walked through the back corridor toward the surgical wing, the one she'd traveled 1,000 times before, her boots making soft sounds on the linoleum floor. At 7:47 a.m., the OR3 doors burst open from the inside. The sound was violent. Sudden. Megan was 40 feet away when she heard it. A man, huge and wrong-shaped, crashed through into the hallway swinging a 2-foot length of rusted rebar like it weighed nothing. He was high on something, his pupils the size of dinner plates, his skin slick with sweat despite the air conditioning, his movements jerky and hyper-focused. He screamed something about bills and hospitals and doctors who didn't care, about the system that had destroyed him, about making someone pay. His name was Derek Simmons. He was 250 pounds of rage and methamphetamine and the particular kind of desperation that comes from losing everything to medical debt. Whitfield backed up against the wall. His hands went up. His mouth opened and closed without sound. The patient on the table lay unconscious, anesthetized, unable to move or defend herself or even understand what was happening. Simmons advanced on Whitfield, rebar raised. The surgical staff scattered like startled birds. A resident grabbed for a panic button. Someone screamed. Security was 60 seconds out. Megan assessed the threat in the time it took to blink. Subject stance, weight forward, legs wide, balance compromised by drug use. Weapon grip, two-handed, but loose on the back end, meaning force was concentrated at the swing point. Angle of attack, overhead arc targeting Whitfield's head. Distance to exits, 2 doors, both blocked. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed their electric song, indifferent. Her body moved before her conscious mind decided anything. Muscle memory from Baghdad, from a decade of close-quarters combat in places where mercy was a luxury and hesitation meant death. She stepped inside Simmons's swing in 3 quick strides, redirected the rebar past her shoulder, felt the weight of it pass through the air that had been her ribcage half a second before. She used his forward momentum against him, his high mass and committed motion, rotated her hips, and brought him down onto the tile floor in a controlled fall that turned into a joint lock. His arm bent backward at an angle that made resistance impossible. Her knee found his spine. The rebar clattered away across the floor. 8 seconds from door breach to complete control. "Don't move," she said quietly, and something in her voice made him go completely still. The same voice that had commanded medical evacuations under fire. The same voice that had talked dying men through their last breaths. The same voice that belonged to someone very different from the deferential nurse who'd been working OR3 for 14 months. The crash brought security running. The crash brought hospital administrators. The crash brought something else entirely, a Marine convoy that had been traveling through San Diego after a training exercise at Camp Pendleton, whose members had been listening to scanner traffic out of boredom, had heard the emergency code and the location, and had decided to investigate. There were 8 of them. They wore desert camouflage and boots polished like mirrors and the particular kind of quiet competence that comes from taking people's lives for a living. The first one through the OR doors was Gunnery Sergeant Marcus Chen. He pushed through the crowd of hospital staff, took one look at Megan holding Simmons on the ground with professional control, with the kind of control that suggested she'd done this hundreds of times before, and his entire posture changed. He snapped to attention. Not parade ground attention, something deeper. Something that meant he recognized something in her that ran deeper than rank. "Master Chief O'Brien," he said, and his voice carried across the sudden silence. The room went still like someone had pressed pause. Megan's eyes closed for just one moment, a blink, barely perceptible. There it was. The cover. Completely blown. Not leaked. Not suspected. Not investigated. Simply gone, spoken aloud in front of 20 witnesses. A Navy captain named Richardson stepped forward from the Marine group, his face carrying the kind of calm authority that came from having made life and death decisions on 6 continents. He pulled out his phone, scrolled to something, and began to read. His voice was formal. Official. The voice of institutions and records and truths that couldn't be disputed. Megan O'Brien, Master Chief Petty Officer, Special Warfare Operator, Naval Special Warfare Command. He paused. Each title hung in the air like a separate thing. 3 bronze stars with Valor. 1 silver star. Navy and Marine Corps Commendation Medal. Purple Heart. The silence was so thick you could perform surgery in it. Richardson continued, his voice carrying 8 years running forward surgical teams in Baghdad. 47 combat missions. 17 under direct enemy fire. Qualification in advanced combat trauma medicine, field anesthesia, emergency resuscitation, and emergency surgical procedures in austere environments. 100 seconds of absolute silence. Nurses who'd worked beside Megan for months stared at her like she'd suddenly transformed into someone they'd never seen. A young resident's mouth hung open. Maria had both hands pressed to her face. Whitfield, still against the wall, had gone the color of old paste, all the blood draining out of his face as the implications crashed over him like an avalanche. But Richardson wasn't finished. Master Chief O'Brien holds the distinction of most lives saved under combat conditions by any Special Forces medical operator in the Iraq theater. 17. He paused. Under enemy fire. She was hand-selected for deep cover operations. The cover at this hospital is classified. A lance corporal who looked barely 20, who had the kind of scar on his neck that suggested he'd learned about mortality at too young an age, stepped forward quietly. "My brother served under her in Fallujah," he said, his voice steady. "He took shrapnel that should have killed him. She carried him 3 blocks through sniper fire. Put a tourniquet on him while mortars were landing. He said she never even looked scared." Colonel Marcus Webb, released from ICU that morning against every recommendation his cardiologist had made, appeared in the OR doorway in a hospital gown and robe, trailing and 4-pole like he was towing an anchor. His voice was hoarse but clear, the voice of a man who'd been pulled back from the edge of death and knew exactly who'd pulled him. That woman performed a pericardiocentesis in a combat operating room in Baghdad with mortar rounds hitting 50 meters away. Saved for men who should have died. Didn't flinch once. He looked at Whitfield with pure contempt. "And you tried to fire her for saving my life." The OR doors exploded inward at 9:53 a.m. 250 pounds of methamphetamine and rage crashed through the sterile field like artillery. A man whose face was all sharp bone and sunken cheek, his eyes the color of spoiled copper, one meaty fist wrapped around a piece of rebar that he swung in a figure-8 pattern that would have killed anyone it connected with. he screamed, not words at first, just animal sound, the kind of primal howl that comes from financial ruin and eviction notices and a lifetime of believing the system had personally conspired to destroy him. His voice cracked like broken glass. They took everything. Everything. My house, my kids, my wife, all of it. Security froze. Dr. Whitfield stood at the surgical table, hands suspended over Colonel Webb's open chest, his entire body seizing with the particular paralysis of a man whose institutional authority meant absolutely nothing to a person high enough not to recognize hierarchy. He stumbled backward, his voice cracking into something that barely resembled speech. Get him out! Call someone! But the moment the rebar came up in an overhead arc aimed at the nearest surgical light, aimed, in fact, at nothing and everything simultaneously, Megan moved. Her body did not ask her permission. Her hands did not consult her training. The muscle memory was deeper than thought, older than fear, the automatic precision of someone who had spent 8 years treating the wounded in places where hesitation meant death. She didn't cross the distance so much as materialize in front of the intruder, her left hand catching the rebar strike at the apex, the impact jarring through her shoulder socket with a sound like a rifle crack, and then, the redirect came as naturally as breathing. She pivoted his own momentum against him, used the rebar itself as a lever, and brought his right arm around and up in an angle that made resistance physically impossible. 8 seconds. Face down on the tile. Knee on his spine. His right arm locked at an angle that would snap bone if he so much as twitched. The rebar lay 3 feet away, skittering across the floor with the hiss of metal on tile. The room didn't gasp. It held its breath. 23 people in surgical masks and gowns stood absolutely motionless, watching as a trauma nurse they'd seen pushing charts and prepping instruments for 8 months held a 250-pound man paralyzed on the ground with the kind of casual authority that made their spines straighten involuntarily. Someone call San Diego PD, Megan said. Her voice had changed. Not in volume, but in something deeper, in the timbre of it, in the absolute absence of question in her tone. It wasn't a request. It was a command issued by someone accustomed to being obeyed. Security personnel finally moved. Police would arrive in 4 minutes. The intruder would spend 47 seconds raging, then go limp, recognizing with the small part of his mind still functional that resistance was no longer an option. But those 47 seconds stretched like hours, and nobody moved, and nobody looked away. And then the trauma bay doors opened again. Not a person entering. A presence. Boots on tile, not hospital issue, but military-grade tan desert boots with a snap and authority that resonated through the floor. Marines in digital camo poured through the trauma bay entrance, and behind them, visible through the doors beyond, sat a Humvee with United States Marines stenciled on the side. A convoy. 12 personnel, maybe 14, moving with the synchronized precision that belongs to people trained to operate as a single organism. The ranking gunnery sergeant stepped forward, 6'4", shoulders like a linebacker, face all sharp angles and weathered tan, and his eyes found Megan in a room full of people and locked onto her with the particular focus of someone recognizing a legend. He snapped to attention. Not casual. Not perfunctory. The kind of salute that carried weight, that meant something beyond military protocol. Master Chief O'Brien, he said. His voice was steady. Respectful. The kind of tone a junior officer uses when addressing someone whose rank exists in a category above the official hierarchy. Trident confirms your position compromised. You're recalled to base. The fluorescent lights hummed in the silence that followed. 23 people in surgical masks processing language they didn't yet understand. The intruder on the floor stopped struggling. Colonel Webb's heart monitor beeped its steady rhythm. A Navy captain stepped forward from the group of Marines, older, his uniform adorned with rank insignia that meant something in ways that hospital titles simply could not. He carried a folder. His voice was formal, public record tone, the kind used when making announcements for posterity. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, U.S. Navy. Service record, classified designation JSOC attached personnel, Central Command Theater, 2013 through 2021. Rank, Master Chief Petty Officer. He paused. Let the weight settle. Bronze Star. He opened the folder slightly, letting the document speak. Bronze Star, second award. Silver Star. Purple Heart, twice decorated. The captain's eyes moved across the surgical team, deliberately, making certain every name in that room heard what came next. 8 years conducting combat medical operations in Baghdad. 41 combat surgical interventions. Casualty rescue rate, 97.3%. Recommendation for Navy Cross pending declassification review. Dr. Whitfield's face underwent a transformation that would have been almost comical in different circumstances. The color drained from it in stages, first the flush of exertion, then the pink of normal circulation, then down to something that resembled old paste, something that resembled a man watching his entire institutional life disintegrate in the space of 4 minutes. His hands, which had been shaking slightly, began to tremble with what might have been rage or might have been the first signals of complete psychological collapse. He opened his mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. No sound emerged that anyone would remember as words. But that wasn't the worst part for Dr. Whitfield. Not by a mile. At 11:15 a.m., Admiral Patricia Morrison arrived at Seattle General in a black SUV with military plates. 2-star flag officer, career trajectory that included command positions at the highest levels, and she came directly to the surgical lounge where Dr. Whitfield was trying to explain himself to a hospital administrator who'd suddenly realized the magnitude of what he was looking at. The Admiral didn't shake his hand. Didn't make small talk. She carried a single piece of paper and read it aloud in front of 30 staff members, every surgeon, every senior nurse, every administrator who could fit into the space, and 2 local news camera crews who'd already gotten wind that something significant was developing. Dr. James Whitfield, your medical license is suspended pending investigation into federal interference charges related to an active intelligence operation. Her voice carried the particular weight of military authority, not louder than anyone else, but somehow more present in the space, like gravity itself had shifted. The Navy appreciates your cooperation, and you will contact the legal office at this facility to arrange full documentation of any communications related to Master Chief O'Brien's employment record. She paused. Folded the paper. You are terminated from your position effective immediately. Your employment history with Seattle General will reflect full compliance with this federal directive. Whitfield tried to speak. The Admiral simply turned and walked away, and the message was clear: he was no longer worthy of being addressed. The cameras caught it all. The angles made it clear that Whitfield was being dismissed, that a decorated military officer had arrived specifically to fire him, that whatever he'd done was serious enough to warrant federal intervention. His defensive comment to a reporter 15 minutes later, her military service is irrelevant to her performance as a nurse, was broadcast on every local news station by 5 p.m., with a split screen showing Megan in her scrubs, then the full service record being read aloud, then Whitfield's dismissive shrug. The narrative wrote itself. His medical license suspension came that evening. Federal charges against board members followed within days. The investigation into supply chain theft that Megan had been conducting under naval intelligence cover suddenly made sense to everyone who'd been questioning her suspension. The pieces fitted together with the perfect clarity of a puzzle where every element had always belonged to a single image. By the end of the week, Whitfield's name was being pulled from job posting sites, his offers rescinded, his phone calls going unreturned. His wife's lawyer called on Friday. 6 months later, a former colleague reported seeing him standing behind a folding table in the parking lot of a strip mall on the outskirts of San Diego, selling supplemental health insurance policies to people who looked away before making eye contact. His name tag was laminated. His shirt was wrinkled. He never quite met anyone's eyes anymore. But Megan didn't spend time thinking about Dr. Whitfield. Not on the day Naval Special Warfare Command offered her a position at their training facility in Coronado, overlooking the Pacific in a building with glass walls and actual windows, something she'd almost forgotten existed. Not when she set up an office with a view of the water, where the light came in at angles that reminded her the world existed beyond fluorescent tiles and beeping monitors. On her desk, the real desk, not a computer station wedged into a corner. She kept one thing. A pair of combat boots. Size 11. The leather was battered beyond recognition, creased in places where leather shouldn't crease, sand from 41 mission still caked in the grooves where boot met sole. The dust from Baghdad. She'd never cleaned them. Never would. They sat there as a permanent reminder that some people walk past the uniform and miss the warrior wearing it entirely. She stood before a class of 32 Special Forces medical trainees 3 months after taking the position, and they were all younger than her, all eager, all burning with the particular intensity of people who believed they were invincible. She held the needle up to eye level, 14-gauge angiocath, the same tool that had saved Colonel Marcus Webb's life, the same tool that had saved 40 soldiers whose names she still knew by heart. In combat, she told them, "You are whoever the mission needs you to be." Her voice had the weight of someone speaking from experience, not theory. But under pressure, you become exactly who you've always been. Her hands demonstrated the angle, the depth, the pressure required. Steady. Precise. Scarred. The fluorescent lights of the training facility hummed above her, different hospital, different building, but the same institutional sound that hospitals everywhere shared, and somehow it no longer felt like a cage. Thank you for watching. If Megan's story resonated with you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who confused a quiet composure with weakness, please subscribe, hit that notification bell, and let me know in the comments, have you ever watched someone finally be recognized for exactly who they really are? What would you have done in Megan's position? The community here is built on people who understand that the quietest person in the room is often the one holding it all together. See you in the next one.